Living somewhere in Japan is a woman in her 50s. She lives alone in a modest home, alone, and from the outside her life seems normal and relatively peaceful. But if you pay more attention to her, you may notice something different. Her arms are covered in tattoos, and she's missing one of her fingers. Today, we're going to be looking at the only female member of the Yakuza ever to be inducted into the organization by oath. This is the story of Nishimura Mako. Before I get into the details on Nishimura, I just want to get one thing out of the way and very vaguely describe what the Yakuza is. Not everyone here will know what the Yakuza is, so in very basic layman's terms, let's just call them the Japanese Mafia. That's essentially what it is. It's an organised crime gang or number of gangs or type of gang in Japan. So that's basically all you need to know. If you want to know more, Google it, I guess. Anyway, Nishimura. Born into a family of government officials, Nishimura had a very strict childhood. She's gone on record recalling her father beating her with a bamboo stick very often as a means of punishment and discipline. Even from a young age, she seemed to get herself into trouble a lot, and in her middle school years strayed well away from societal standards in Japan at the time. After middle school, she opted not to go to high school and instead hung around Gifu, where she lived, and hung around with local biker gangs who taught her how to fight. She used these skills a lot and would just hang around beating up local delinquents and even apparently junior Yakuza members of her local area. Mako today is covered in tattoos, but this journey started for her when she was only 18. Now in Japan, tattoos are a big deal. The attitude to them there is completely different to what you'd see in the West. This attitude is deeply rooted in historical, cultural and social significance and a lot of history. Traditionally in Japan, the only people with tattoos were members of the Yakuza, and as I've said, they are an organised crime group. This led to widespread social stigma around tattoos, which still exists today in some parts of Japan, although it is getting a little bit better. Because tattoos are viewed as a sign of criminality, this was a really risky move for Nishimura to get them at only 18 when she's not even affiliated with any crime group. If she was affiliated with some sort of crime group, they could at the very least look after her and she'd have someone to cover her back, but at this time she was just on her own. In Japan, if you have tattoos, you are ostracised from going to certain places. For example, public baths, swimming pools, gyms and even beaches prohibit individuals with tattoos from even attending, as to try and keep it a family-friendly area and feeling. Which ultimately means no public bath time for Machine Gun Kelly or Adam Levine or Ben Affleck. Did you know Ben Affleck has a huge phoenix on his back? I bet you didn't know. Batman can't use the swimming pool in Japan. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, Nishimura. Nishimura's reputation for fighting and general rebellion led her to meet a young Yakuza member who took her under his wing and taught her a lot of different things about the criminal underworld, including, but not limited to, how to collect protection money, how to blackmail people, and how to run a prostitution ring. Which wasn't very girls supporting girls of her, but you know, there we go. Nishimura was also known to take part in fights between biker gangs. Now in Japan, there are entire gangs of female bikers, but Nishimura only interacted with the male gangs, and as such had way more fights with men than she ever did women. Nishimura was known to be a very competent fighter though. In a quote by herself, she claims, "I was great at fighting. I never lost against a man." Her life would take a turn one night when she received a phone call from a friend. Her friend was in a violent dispute and needed her help desperately. Nishimura turned up to the area armed with a club and turned the incident into a bloodbath. This incident, as well as her general reputation, which had been brewing under the surface for quite some time, got the attention of a local oyabun. For context, an oyabun is essentially a boss of a local Yakuza syndicate. In this case, the Sumiyoshi Kai, which are the second largest Yakuza syndicate in the entirety of Japan. The Sumiyoshi Kai. I'm Kai. The Sumiyoshi Me. When Nishimura was brought to the oyabun, he claimed that it would be a waste if she was just, quote, somebody's woman, and he agreed to enter her into the syndicate as if she were a man. She claims he said to her, "Even if you're a woman, you must become Yakuza." Now, There are other women who claim to be Yakuza, but they're not fully fledged members like Nishimura. Most of the women who claim to be Yakuza, or are called Yakuza by other people in Japan, are usually wives or relatives of male Yakuza members. Women in the Yakuza usually perform informal roles. This could include looking after young affiliates or mediating between smaller groups, although on the higher end of the spectrum they can be trusted to run Yakuza-run clubs or even to get involved in drug deals. But Nishimura was different. Nishimura took part in the Sakazuki, which is the ritual required to be inducted into the Yakuza. This made her a fully fledged member of the Yakuza, the same as any of her male counterparts. Now, the details of the ritual known as Sakazuki are not fully known, but what she said about it is that she took part in it wearing a male kimono. It seems that, for all intents and purposes, they would attempt to treat her as a man within the organisation. The ritual of Sakazuki has been mythologized, and as such we don't really know the specifics of what it actually involves. Some claim that it involves mixing one's blood with sake and then consuming it, while the Oyabun sits opposite you and just consumes sake, after which you are now formally a member of the Yakuza. Nishimura was only 20 when this conversation happened with the Oyabun, and she accepted almost immediately. It's important to understand that she'd been passed around from juvenile detention centres for the best part of several years now, and her family had finally given up trying to save her and didn't have any contact. Joining the Yakuza was maybe the best thing she could have ever hoped for in terms of protection and some feel of family bond. Being scouted by the Yakuza never really happened. You had to try and join. You had to seek out the Yakuza and then try and join them. Usually this was done by having a friend in the Yakuza or a family member, and that would be an inroad for you to join the organisation. For the Yakuza to scout you specifically was incredibly rare. For the Sumiyoshi Kai to scout you specifically was even rarer. To be scouted specifically by the Sumiyoshi Kai as a woman was unheard of and has never happened before and might never happen again. But the Yakuza aren't just about cracking heads and causing violent crime. In fact, the Yakuza are known for having a very strict code of conduct. Maybe the most common part of these tenets is that you're not allowed to just beat up random pedestrians, innocent people, or even police officers. Because at the end of the day, having the government and the local law enforcement bear down on your organisation is no good for business. Upon joining the Yakuza, you could be made a Heizumi, where you will spend about 2 to 3 years in this role. That is what happened to Nishimura, and what happens to every single one of the other male newbies who joined alongside her. A Heizumi is essentially a housekeeper, a maid, personal assistant, anything you need for the local Yakuza. You run around doing things from cleaning, scrubbing the toilets, to pouring tea and cleaning the Oyabun's car. Anything he wants, or official members want, you have to do. It's during this time that these tenets are instilled in you, and the etiquette of being a Yakuza member is also drilled into you. This happened to Mako. As I said, Nishimura had to fulfill this role, and she recounts having a gun pointed at her by a senior member who she had upset through one way or another. But after her 2 to 3 years stint, she was finally inducted into the Yakuza. Her main source of profit while in the Yakuza is said to be drug dealing, weapon dealing, blackmail, and again running a prostitution ring, although it was not plain sailing for her in the Yakuza. Nishimura was eventually asked to engage in yubitsume, which is the act of cutting off one of your fingers, in this case her pinky finger. Yubitsume is seen as an act of penitence or forgiveness, where you have to do that to be forgiven for something you've done wrong. Now, sources vary on what it was she did wrong. One source said that she was caught taking drugs, and that it was weird because everyone else was doing drugs, but she was the only one who was made to cut her finger off. And another source says that she did it to apologise for a collective mistake. So I don't really know what it was for. You are expected to do this amputation yourself, and she did it alarmingly easy, to the degree that all of her peers were shocked by how proficient she was with it and how she didn't seem to care too much. So much was her proficiency at removing fingers that she was made the master of finger cutting, and when other members were told to cut their fingers off for mistakes, if they couldn't do it, Nishimura would do it for them. As well as master of finger cutting, there's also some sources that refer to her as the Devil's Child, which was a nickname she apparently had. Now, it has to be addressed. One might suspect that a lone woman in an entire group of male Yakuza might not be a good idea. Especially when she was at the bottom of the pile in terms of ranking, you could maybe assume or suspect that male members of the Yakuza, particularly more senior members, might try and take advantage of her, although she claims that this was never the case. Due to her reputation for violence, apparently male members were even scared to ask her out, never mind anything else. She was said to have a love for guns, although she claims to have never shot anyone. She recounts going outdoors during broad daylight to fire guns and test fire them, which she would do near a local railway track as to mask the sound of the gunshots. After around 10 years in the Yakuza, she would eventually leave in her 30s. The timeline on this is a little bit wavy, because sources do tend to vary. Some say she became disenfranchised with the organisation, ran away, and then met her husband, whereas some say she met her husband and then ran away. Regardless, after leaving the Yakuza, she would get married, suspiciously, to a member of the Yakuza, a rival group of Yakuza, known as the Yamaguchi-gumi, which is Japan's biggest Yakuza group, and more importantly, enemies of the Sumiyoshi Kai. She claims to have met him at a dinner party where he attended just by chance. They got along, one thing led to another, and eventually they decided to get married. Shortly after, she fell pregnant, and would eventually go on to have 2 kids with her husband. But life would not be plain sailing for Nishimura. Unfortunately, covered in tattoos and missing a finger, she struggled to get any type of regular employment. As such, she went back to what she knew, running a prostitution racket and drug dealing. Her and her husband's relationship would also deteriorate massively, and their altercations were said to be incredibly violent, which, I mean, you know, 2 Yakuza members in a marriage, who would have guessed that it turned violent almost immediately. They would eventually divorce, and her husband would get custody of both their children. Nishimura would then try and rejoin her gang at the age of 40, which she eventually did, but only for about 2 years before she decided to leave again. She came back to find the group not what she'd left. The Oyabun, who she once adored and looked up to, had now been ruined by meth, and the group itself had changed in terms of its ideals and what it stood for. After leaving for the second and final time, she successfully secured a job in the demolition business, which is quite fitting to be fair, and now she lives alone in a modest home, living a relatively quiet life. Nishimura openly speaks about her time in the Yakuza and her life. She even published a book of memos, which some of it I used to get the sources for this video. There's a lot of articles about Nishimura and a lot of writings about her, but a lot of them contradict. There's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of things which aren't quite right. So if I've got something wrong in this video, that's why. From Western publications, there's a lot of them that try to add a political stance to her story. Some of them try to show her as some kind of like girl boss feminist figure, but she's insisted that she never wanted to be that. She said it was never her intention to break gender roles, or to publicise herself as the only female Yakuza. In fact, from everything I've seen, Nishimura has never really claimed herself to be the only female Yakuza. It's just other people who've recognised it for what it is. She is the only female Yakuza in history. I think being apolitical as well suits Nishimura. Her story isn't one about politics and rising up above some sort of glass ceiling. It is one of survival. Nishimura run multiple prostitution brackets and would scout girls for this, which doesn't fit the MO of somebody who is trying to collectively raise women up. Which is why I think it's important to view Nishimura as what she is, not some sort of political figure or mythological hero. She lived a very brutal life, a very brutal upbringing, and only now has seemed to have any form of stability, after losing her marriage and her kids. The misinformation around Nishimura is plentiful. There is a lot, and I had a very difficult time getting sources for this video, because they're either in Japanese, where then I have to translate it, which means that the meaning can get twisted, or they are taken from somebody who had a very specific point they wanted to prove, usually politically. A lot of the people who covered this are political mouthpieces or something like that, and that's not what I'm trying to do on this channel at all. Honestly, there were other women who claimed to be Yakuza, for example Tsuka Fumiko, but she was not formally affiliated. Although, it must be said, Fumiko is said to have made a significant impact on the Yakuza itself. And maybe I'll do a video about her one day too. But Nishimura is the only fully inducted member into the Yakuza, and I think that's pretty damn interesting. Hey everyone, I just wanted to give a quick message at the end just to say thank you. It's only my 3rd video, but the reception to my videos has been amazing, beyond anything I could have expected. Honestly, when I started this channel I expected to get 50 views tops, so the fact that my first video got just shy of 2,000, and then my second video got 1,000. That's incredible. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Since then, this has been something I've really looked forward to doing, and this video is very different from the other two I did, which are a lot more goofy. I only covered Nishimura today because it was something I found interesting, and if you like this kind of video, please let me know and I might do more of it. On this channel you can expect a mixture of silly videos like the phone one and then more factual ones like this one on Nishimura. I'm just going to be talking about things that I find interesting or that I find funny, and hopefully you find it funny too. So if you like what I'm doing here, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.